You know, if there's one question I get asked more than any other, more even than why does February have 28 days when couldn't you just easily grab a couple of days from one of the ones that have 31? That question would have to be, Mark, can a Nikon Ai-S Zoom Nikkor 35-200mm f3.5 to 4.5s from the 1980s be a viable Japanese street photography lens? Well, today we're going to try and answer that question. So it was late February, not the 30th, and I was in Tokyo and I wanted to go out and take some street photos on film. Now, the classic choice of lens for this kind of photography would be something small and moderately wide. Maybe climb on the Diane Arbus with a 35mm, or go a little bit narrower, get your Henri Cartier-Bresson with a 50mm lens. But I didn't do that. Instead, I picked up this monstrous, hulking piece of metal and glass, an old manual 35-200mm zoom lens. Today we're going to try and explore why.
So here I am in Harajuku, Tokyo, in front of the legendary Takeshita Street. We have one Nikon FE, we have one 35-200mm lens, and we have one roll of Kodak Colorplus. So look, we won't probably spend too long on Takeshita Street. It's kind of a chaotic and busy street, but it's somewhere I always like to visit whenever I'm in Tokyo. This is the fourth time I've been in Tokyo. I'm flying out tomorrow and I haven't been here yet. So I'm taking a quick walk down the street and then wending my way back to the hotel at a leisurely pace through the Tokyo suburbs. Something a little bit more abstract, perhaps. I like the colors. So for this one, I'm going to try and go a little bit macro, blur out the background, but I love the design on the bag. Now the problem with the lens I have is it's quite a slow lens, and it means that capturing birds in flight like that isn't going to happen. It's also very difficult to do a decisive moment type of shot, simply because if I want to zoom in and out, it uses one of those tromboning pump zooms, and that zoom in particular is quite stiff and quite slow. Okay, who doesn't love a crepe? question is there a shot in this or not? And I just don't know. The lights, both good and bad. Let's try it from the other side. What do we see? Okay. Really colourful. Alright, another intrinsically interesting shop front, but this time I'm going to try and get someone in it. You've got to love GoPro. I mean, I've already taken, 10 shots, and I don't know how many of them are recorded because the GoPro hung on me. It's literally 12 degrees on a winter's day in Tokyo, and the GoPro overheats with the media mod on it. One of those only in Japan moments where you get to play with your choice of otter. Maruko is looking the most interesting to me, but apparently the otters don't actually carry credit cards, so just be aware of that.
I got to go.
So all over the world, people hang their sneakers up from phone lines. See if I can get this person coming the other side of me. Focusing on his foreground. No, he wasn't moving. I was. Just that in itself is kind of cool. Could be an interesting telephoto shot. We'll see. I think this is going to be one of those sit and wait moments. Well, I didn't have to wait too long. Let's face it, not the most exciting people walking by, but hey, it's Monday.
Now, you may have thought that those weird color shifts on the last couple of frames were because I accidentally opened up the back of the camera at the end of the roll before winding it back. I will forgive you your lack of faith in my obviously deliberate aesthetic choices. And you can repay me by liking this video and subscribing to the channel while I turn my attention to the Nikon Ai-S Zoom Nikkor 35-200mm f3.5 to 4.5s lens. Was it the logical choice for the street? Probably not. But while I do find that it is clumsy, I also find that it is the lens that I use more than just about any other manual focus lens I own. Why? It's an optical marvel. No, hear me out. For those of you that spit vehemently on the floor at the description of a manual focus super zoom lens as a marvel, you have to cast your mind back to those bleak days of the early 80s when the optical imaging world was disrupted by the introduction of zoom lenses. I'll get to the optical qualities of this lens a bit later. But imagine the early 80s as a tumultuous time for lens manufacturing. Autofocus was starting to get its clumsy foot in the door and zooms were becoming more commonplace. After all, who doesn't want a lens that gives you great versatility and ease of use? In 1982, the longest zoom that Nikon could offer was a 50-135 f3.5. In the subsequent years, its range extended to 35-105 and 35-135, so you can see how they were incrementally improving things over time. This particular lens was released in 1985 after what was, by all accounts, a long and tortuous process of designing and refining it to achieve its 5.7 times zoom range. That was the same year that Nikon also brought out the f501. And this was its first autofocus SLR, and I'll definitely review this at some point. This is the N2020, the US version of that camera. But let's just say that as much as I love this camera, it's not for its autofocus performance. While the Nikon L35AF back in 1983 showed the potential of autofocus compact cameras, it wasn't really mainstream at this point, and even the 501 was released at the same time as a manual focus camera, the f301, which was probably more popular. No autofocus, but a very large zoom range on this particular lens. And in that context, when this was released, it was probably already a little out of date while still somehow being overly ambitious at the same time. The result is a compromise, but isn't everything in life a compromise? You're always going to struggle fitting your baby bassinet in your Bugatti Veyron, and if you've ever actually owned a pocket knife, you'll understand the limits of your corkscrew and scissors. Of course, that tool for getting the stones out of horses' hooves is 100% fit for purpose, even if that's a purpose that you'll never need. But I digress. Yes, it's a compromise. While the zoom range is great, it doesn't go wider than 35mm. The maximum aperture is f3.5 at the wide end, and it's variable down to 4.5 at the long end, so not the worst, but not very fast. It can focus as close as 0.27 meters or 0.86 feet, giving a decent, if not quite macro, 1:4 life-size reproduction. Annoyingly, that's only at the 35mm end, accessible by a ring that increases the distance from the focal plane, effectively a built-in extension tube. It would be nice to have had it at the longer end to give you more working distance, but it is what it is. It does have amazing build quality, and I mean amazing. You could bludgeon your baby with it, and given that you may need to actually squeeze him into your Bugatti, that's a selling point in itself. In any case, If you dropped it on your toes, you'd be much more worried about your toes than the lens. It weighs 740 grams or 1.63 pounds for you imperialists, and that's heavy. But it's surprisingly compact. It's actually got a 62mm filter thread, which is really quite small and probably smaller than most modern super zooms. Compare it to the modern 24-200mm Nikon Z lens, and it still holds its own when you think that it's nearly 40 years later. Well, look, okay, it might teeter a bit. While it balances okay on my Nikon FE, it's not exactly discreet. The push-pull zoom itself is kind of a compromise. I do have a couple of these style lenses, and once you've had some practice, it's actually possible to zoom in and focus in one action. But this lens is bigger and much stiffer and clumsier than most of my others. But it is what it is, and I guess that's going to be the theme of this review. But if it is what it is, then what is it? With all these compromises, is it good enough? One roll down and halfway home. Let's see how we get on with the second roll.
Chanel, Dior, it's all here at Omotesando. Got to say, some of the design is quite stunning. I've got to say, I'm loving this minimalist design aesthetic. Is this a showroom or a mechanics? It looks new. I think that they're just working it out. Oh. Beautiful. A portrait of the artist as an old man. And as if Tintin wasn't enough, now I have Moomin to tempt me. Pure Finland. Wow. Yeah, this isn't a poor suburb, but I guess it's a little bit less ostentatious than the Ferrari I saw in Nakamagura. Omotesando suddenly gives way to Shibuya. And Tower Records. I did want to buy some vinyl, and I wonder if I'll get there tonight. Last night, let's see. So the crossing over there beneath the sign is the Ginza line. So I know where I am now. Sometimes the reflections of Shibuya actually look better than the city itself.
So what did you think? Is the Nikon 35-200mm the Swiss Army knife of lenses, or am I expecting too much? I mean, you can't open up a bottle of wine with it or get the stones out of horses' hooves, but can you take good pictures? Earlier, I called this an optical marvel, and when you think about it, there's a lot of lens crammed in here. Realistically, the marvel is that they managed to create it and not be totally crap, with 17 elements in 13 groups all working together to minimize aberration and field curvature at the various zoom lengths. It should have the light transmission qualities of a lump of coal. But somehow, light manages to reach the film plane, and while this isn't a 50mm f1.2Z lens, that lens can't shoot 35mm or 85mm or 135mm or 200mm. You get the idea. It does distort, but that's a very fixable thing, and I've had no problems bending those lines back to right angles in post. f3.5 is slow, but you could see on a winter's day it was still quite usable with 200 speed Kodak Colorplus. The corners are soft, wide open, and diffraction creeps in by f11, but it's rare that I'm going to want to shoot f22 anyway. Look, I called it a marvel, and if there's a downside to that, using it is the creative equivalent of watching a Marvel movie. You get a bit of comedy, romance, fantasy, action, and that's even before I've taken a photo. Just trying to compose, zoom, and focus with it is a bit of a drama. It's not a shoot from the hip art house experience, though you could probably push a roll of HP5 in there if you wanted that black and white Zack Snyder aesthetic. Perhaps my biggest complaint is that it is a bit like Captain Marvel. Overpowered, but leaden and dull as a result.
There's no competition for me because I'm the strongest, so it's just kind of like a...
And I guess it ends up being quite unsatisfying because it never really lives up to its own ambition. You've seen that the best photos are the ones where I've had time to think through the composition, to take in a street scene, capture close-up detail, or narrow the frame to the point where I can identify little details or find angles in the architecture. The strength of this lens is its versatility, not its sharpness or the speed with which you can compose and shoot. In doing some research on this lens from people who actually know what they're talking about, I found Nikon's own review that I'll link to in the description of this video. The fact that the words relatively and satisfactory both appear 6 times in this article tells you something, and that's coming from Nikon's own PR machine. It was never Nikon's most successful lens, but I think that was down to the fact that its heft came with a hefty price tag. As of 1996, this was still selling for $1,290 US. And while it's long discontinued now, it's a testament to the engineering that went into it and the fact that there weren't any great alternatives at the time. As early as 1983, Tamron did have a 35-210mm lens available, but from everything I've read about it, if it's a Marvel, it's much more Carol Danvers than Nick Fury. For 15% of the original asking price, you can probably pick up an excellent copy of this lens, leave it on your camera, so why even bother to slum it in the third-party ghetto? And honestly, I've never had anyone complain about the image quality of the lens. People don't look at my photos and go, "Oh, did you use a Nikon Ai-S Zoom Nikkor 35-200mm f3.5 to 4.5s? I mean, they'll say, "Did you take a photo of that?" But that one's on me, not the lens. To me, it's sharp enough. And when I look through my Lightroom catalog, it's probably my most used lens. Now, if you think about why that is, it's probably because I lack any sense of aesthetic intent as a photographer. I'm not getting up before a sunrise to capture that perfect 20mm landscape, or using it exclusively for shallow depth of field portraits or sports photography. I mean, look at me. Sports. So that's the lens I put on when I'm indecisive or feeling lazy. It's a great travel lens, and I'm also using it in a way that I can just stick it on my camera and go out and walk the dog, or if I don't have any sense of photographic opportunities that might be out there. For me, that's most of the time, and so for me, this lens is actually quite ideal. But let me know your own thoughts. What is your most versatile lens? Would you use a bloated beast like this? Or do you prefer to just take a wide prime lock to f8, zone focus, and capture that decisive moment? Let me know in the comments below. Later.